18 earthquakes shook one Southern California town in a single hour last night, and not a single one of them qualified as the big one. There wasn't one. That absence is the whole story. It's the fingerprint of what geologists call a swarm, and this particular swarm chose about the worst possible neighborhood to break out in, right beside the southern end of the San Andreas fault, a stretch of ground that hasn't ruptured in over 3 centuries. Most of the time, activity like this fizzles out and gets forgotten. This exact patch of Earth pulled the same stunt back in May. So let's walk through what scientists are actually tracking to figure out whether this fades quietly or turns into something else. Just after midnight, the ground beneath Brawley, California, a farming community most Americans couldn't place on a map, started cracking open. At 12:14 a.m. Pacific time, a magnitude 3.1 quake struck roughly 7 kilometers south of town, about 10 to 12 kilometers underground. On its own, that's not news. Southern California produces small tremors constantly. But 17 minutes later, at 12:31 a.m., a magnitude 3.6 hit almost the identical location, slightly deeper at around 11 kilometers. Then came a 3.4 at around 1:50 a.m., and they didn't stop. By sunrise, seismic instruments had recorded somewhere between 17 and 18 quakes within roughly that first hour alone, most sitting between magnitude 1.6 and 2.8, with several breaking past magnitude 3. Here's the detail that separates this from a garden-variety earthquake sequence. There was no headline event followed by fading aftershocks. Nothing acted like the main quake. Instead, a whole cluster of similarly sized tremors arrived in a stop-and-start, unpredictable rhythm with no clear ringleader. Seismologists have a specific word for that pattern, a swarm, and swarms don't obey the usual playbook. Around 36 residents in Brawley, Holtville, and Haber felt the magnitude 3.6 strongly enough to report it to the U.S. Geological Survey. No injuries, no structural damage. By itself, a night like that is an inconvenience, not a crisis. What earns this cluster of unremarkable quakes real attention has almost nothing to do with their size. It's about their address. This specific stretch of ground sits right at the entrance to arguably the most dangerous dormant fault system in the country, the segment of the San Andreas that hasn't produced a major rupture in more than 300 years. And every time this doorway starts rattling, the researchers who study it professionally drop everything and look north. So let's dig into what happened, what it actually means, and the concrete indicators experts are watching to determine whether this is background noise or a warning shot. This corner of the state is known as the Brawley Seismic Zone, and it's one of the most seismically restless spots in California. To understand why last night matters, you need to understand why a swarm behaves completely differently from a typical earthquake sequence. Most people imagine an earthquake as one dramatic jolt, followed by a tail of shrinking aftershocks that quiet down over hours or days. That's the textbook version, and it comes from a single fault plane rupturing and then gradually stabilizing. Swarms don't follow that script. In a swarm, you get dozens, sometimes hundreds, of quakes packed tightly together in location, with no single event towering above the rest, switching on and off in bursts that can stretch across days or weeks. Last night's magnitude 3.6 wasn't a main shock. It was simply the largest one so far. The underlying mechanism is different too. A conventional main shock comes from accumulated stress. Pressure builds along a fault until it finally snaps. A swarm is usually powered by fluid instead, water, and occasionally magma, pushing through fractured rock, shifting pressure on small fault segments and letting them slip in increments. That's why swarms defy the normal statistical patterns. They don't decay predictably the way aftershocks do. They can go completely silent and then flare back up without warning, because what's driving them isn't one fault relaxing. It's fluid moving through a cracked-up system, and fluid doesn't behave on a schedule. That distinction carries real weight. After a conventional main shock, the worst is usually statistically over. With a swarm, there's no such comfort, because there's no headline event to point to as the peak. The largest quake of the sequence might already be behind us, or it might still be ahead. That uncertainty isn't a gap in the science. It's baked into the physics itself, and it's exactly why a cluster of magnitude 3 tremors here gets taken more seriously than it would almost anywhere else. If this felt like déjà vu to anyone in Brawley, it should have. This is far from the first time this stretch of ground has acted up, and it isn't even the first time this year. Just over 2 months earlier, on May 9th and 10th, this same structure triggered a much bigger swarm. It opened quietly with a barely detectable magnitude, 1.6, roughly 5 miles down, climbed to a magnitude 3.5 that same afternoon, and peaked just after midnight on the 10th with a magnitude 4.7, strong enough to jolt people awake. Felt reports came in from as far as San Diego, more than 200 kilometers away. By the time it wound down, the USGS had logged over 300 separate quakes. One local resident told a reporter at the time that the shaking simply wouldn't let up, wave after wave with the ground still trembling as they spoke. That May episode is essential context because it shows exactly what the structure is capable of. Those quakes occurred at depths ranging from roughly 2 to 15 kilometers along a compact fault only about 6 kilometers long, running northeast, southwest, positioned just north of the Imperial Fault's tip. One detail worth remembering, the largest events in May originated at the deepest points, between 13 and 16 kilometers down. That's not incidental. Rock gets stronger with depth, meaning quakes that begin down there start under greater stress and have more fault surface available to rupture before running out of room. A swarm event that ignites deep has more room to escalate than its shallower counterparts. This same buried structure also flared up in late 2016 and early 2017. That means we're now watching the identical fault system reactivate 3 separate times across roughly a decade. Winter 2016, this past May, and now July. A fault restarting swarms repeatedly over months and years isn't mysterious. It's documented behavior. It's simply what this zone does. But each new episode resets the one question nobody can answer ahead of time. Where does this particular sequence stop? The broader region has a longer history, and it defines the realistic ceiling. In August 2012, a swarm just north of last night's activity produced 2 quakes above magnitude 5, a 5.3 and a 5.5, plus hundreds of smaller shocks, causing minor damage in Brawley. Back in 1981, the Westmoreland earthquake hit magnitude 5.8, though that one behaved more like a conventional main shock and aftershock sequence rather than a true swarm. And in 2020, another Westmoreland swarm grew active enough that the USGS issued a formal forecast before things settled. Taken together, these events sketch out a rough working ceiling for swarm activity in this zone, somewhere around magnitude 5.5, strong enough to crack plaster and shatter windows, not on its own strong enough to level a region. To understand why this matters beyond Brawley, you have to see what this seismic zone connects to. The Brawley seismic zone isn't an isolated patch of restless ground. It functions as a transfer zone, essentially a geological junction box, where the northern tip of the Imperial Fault hands off tectonic motion to the southern end of the San Andreas Fault beneath the Salton Sea. Picture it as the coupling joint between 2 of California's most consequential faults. When the Brawley zone rattles, it's rattling right at the base of the San Andreas. And the specific segment of the San Andreas that begins here is the one that worries seismologists most. This is the southernmost stretch, running along the northeast shore of the Salton Sea, past a small settlement called Bombay Beach, and up toward the Coachella Valley and greater Los Angeles beyond. This section has one defining problem: silence. It hasn't produced a major earthquake in at least 300 years. Trenching studies that dated disturbed soil layers across the fault, published by Philibosian and colleagues in 2011, mapped out its rupture history and found it tends to break loose roughly every 180 years on average. Do the math, and this segment isn't just due for a rupture. It's significantly overdue. So when a swarm ignites right at the junction leading into that fault, the obvious question emerges. Could these small tremors at the doorway be enough to nudge the sleeping giant next door awake? That's a genuinely open scientific question. Not one with a settled answer either way. The honest answer is that the triggering mechanism is real, but it's weak, and distance matters enormously. Earthquakes do alter stress on nearby faults, but a magnitude 3 or 4 event only meaningfully changes stress within a few kilometers of itself. That means concern peaks when a swarm is happening, directly on top of the San Andreas terminus. Last night's activity sat roughly 60 kilometers south of that terminus, close enough to keep the question relevant, but far enough that the actual stress being transferred to the San Andreas is minor, nowhere near what it would be if this were unfolding at Bombay Beach itself. Globally, there are documented cases where swarms preceded much larger earthquakes, but those cases are rare exceptions. The overwhelming majority of swarms simply rise, sputter, and fade, full stop. It would be irresponsible to sell fear without the actual base rates, so here they are. The single most likely outcome for this sequence is that it follows the same arc as May, climbing, possibly touching the low magnitude 4 range, rattling some windows, and dying out over days to weeks without producing anything larger. That's the baseline expectation, and if this had to place a bet, it would bet on quiet. The statistics back this up. Worldwide, only about 5 to 10% of moderate earthquakes turn out, in hindsight, to have been foreshocks for something bigger. The odds that any given moderate quake gets followed by a larger one within 3 days sit around 6% globally. The catch is that a foreshock can only be identified as one after the larger quake happens. Until then, it's statistically indistinguishable from the thousands of quakes that lead nowhere. So anyone claiming with certainty that last night was definitely a foreshock is asserting a kind of predictive power that no seismologist actually possesses. It's also worth remembering what the proven hazard in this region actually looks like, because it isn't the swarm. The faults connected to the Brawley zone have a well-documented record of genuinely destructive earthquakes. Twin magnitude, 6.0 shocks an hour apart in the Imperial Valley in 1915. The magnitude 6.9 El Centro earthquake in 1940. A 6.5 in the same valley in 1979. A 6.5 at Superstition Hills in 1987. And the magnitude 7.2 El Mayor Cucapá earthquake just across the border in Mexico in 2010. Those are the events that have actually damaged buildings and hurt people. The swarm is the noisy symptom. Those larger, historically documented quakes are the real reason residents here keep earthquake kits ready. Still, there's a legitimate reason to keep watching, and it isn't hype. This is the one location in California where the USGS actually has a formal operational protocol to raise the published probability of a San Andreas rupture in real time. It has a documented historical ceiling, a documented habit of reactivating, and it has twice already prompted the agency into public action. To understand why that matters, we need to revisit what happened here in 2016. There's a genuine mystery buried in this whole story, and it deserves your attention because it's the part that actually matters most. The most seismically active patch of ground in Southern California sits directly at the foot of the quietest major fault in the entire state. Constant low-level rumbling at the doorstep, total stillness on the fault itself. The Brawley zone swarms, pauses, and restarts almost continuously. The southern San Andreas, only a few dozen kilometers away, has done essentially nothing for 300 years, and it's the quiet one that poses the real danger. Scientists have a leading theory for why that segment has stayed dormant so long, and it involves a lake that no longer exists. For thousands of years, the Salton Trough was periodically filled by a massive body of water called Lake Cahuilla, far larger than today's shrinking Salton Sea. Research published by Hill and colleagues in 2023 found something striking. The last several major ruptures on the southernmost San Andreas each coincided, with periods when that ancient lake was full. The theory is that the sheer weight of that water and the pressure it exerted into the crust may have acted as a natural trigger, helping the fault release on something closer to a regular schedule. That lake has been essentially gone for centuries, and the modern Salton Sea is only a fading remnant of it, which may be precisely why the fault's internal clock appears to have slowed down. Here's the unsettling implication. If the lake was helping the fault release built-up strain on a predictable timeline, then its disappearance didn't make the fault any safer. It just removed the mechanism that used to trigger release. The strain has kept accumulating this entire time. Several meters of it are now stored in that segment, with nothing left to help release it. The silence isn't calm. It's a loaded spring with a stuck safety catch. The clearest real-world precedent for how seriously to treat a swarm here comes from September 2016 at Bombay Beach, right at the fault's terminus. That month, a swarm of roughly 100 earthquakes, topping out near magnitude 4.3, broke out directly on top of the San Andreas. Because of that exact positioning, the USGS did something it almost never does. It ran real-time calculations and publicly raised the estimated odds of a magnitude 7 or greater San Andreas earthquake over the following week to as high as 1 in 100. For comparison, normal background odds in any given week sit around 1 in 6,000, a hundredfold jump. California's Office of Emergency Services issued a formal advisory for several days. The state was visibly on alert, and then nothing happened. The swarm faded, the elevated odds decayed back to baseline within the week, and the advisory quietly expired. That's not a failure of the science. It's the science functioning exactly as intended. A 1 in 100 probability means that 99 times out of 100, nothing happens. And 2016 landed in that 99. Two things from that episode are worth holding on to. First, the system is built around transparency, not concealment. When the odds rose, the public was told immediately and openly. Second, the reason those 2016 odds spiked so dramatically, and why last night's odds would be considerably lower, comes down to the one variable that governs everything here: proximity to the terminus. Bombay Beach sat right on it. Brawley sits 60 kilometers away. To really grasp why this zone swarms the way it does, picture what's happening beneath the farmland of the Imperial Valley. Because it's genuinely unusual geology. This corner of California is being actively pulled apart. The Brawley seismic zone marks the northernmost dryland edge of the Gulf of California rift system. The same tectonic stretching that's slowly separating Baja California from the mainland and widening the Gulf. At the top of that rift, the crust runs thin, hot, and saturated with fluid moving through a dense network of fractures. That underground plumbing is what powers the swarms. Since swarms are fluid-driven rather than stress-driven, and this location has an unusual abundance of hot fluid circulating through broken rock, it's practically an ideal environment for producing the irregular, restart-prone, no single main shock sequences this zone is known for. This is also where a legitimate, science-backed concern deserves fair mention. The Salton Sea geothermal field operates in the same zone, extracting hot fluid to generate electricity and re-injecting fluid back underground. Research by Brodsky and Lohman, published in 2013, found a real correlation. The background rate of small earthquakes in that field tracks the net rate of fluid extraction. So human activity is, to some measurable degree, part of the seismic picture here. That's a genuine finding. But it comes with firm limits. This zone was producing swarms for thousands of years before any power plant existed. Last night's activity occurred south of the main geothermal field, and nothing in that research suggests a geothermal operation could trigger a magnitude 7 rupture on a fault 60 kilometers away. Induced seismicity is real and well documented. Induced megaquakes on the San Andreas are not. There's one more piece worth addressing, because plenty of people are going to encounter this story already wrapped in a misleading frame online. About 3 hours after the Brawley swarm began, a magnitude 5.0 earthquake struck the Texas Panhandle near the small town of Spearman at a shallow depth under 6 kilometers. Within hours, social media posts were claiming the two events happened simultaneously and implying some kind of continent-wide connection, as though the middle of the country had lurched all at once. Let's take that apart properly, because debunking it clearly is more useful than just ignoring it. The two quakes were roughly 3 hours apart, not simultaneous. They occurred about 1,700 kilometers from one another, and the stress that one earthquake transfers to trigger another fades out within a few kilometers for a magnitude 3 or 4 event, and within a few tens of kilometers for a magnitude 5. There is no physical mechanism, none, connecting a swarm in California to a moderate quake in Texas, 700 kilometers away. What you're looking at is simple coincidence math. This planet produces roughly 150 earthquakes of magnitude, 4.5 or greater every single week. Two unusual events landing on the same night isn't a pattern. It's what randomness looks like. The Texas quake has its own separate, worthwhile story. It occurred in a region where oil and gas wastewater injection has been driving induced seismicity for years, a legitimate issue in its own right, but entirely unrelated to Brawley. And while we're clearing up misinformation, space weather was quiet that night too. Geomagnetically calm, with low readings across the board, which rules out the recurring claim that solar activity or planetary alignments are somehow shaking the Earth. There was no cosmic trigger. The actual driver here is local, fluid moving through broken rock at the top of a tectonic rift. So here's what was promised. The specific concrete indicators scientists are actually tracking to determine whether last night was noise or the start of something serious. Nothing here is vague. There are 3 signals, and you can track them yourself. The first is magnitude. If the swarm climbs past May's peak of magnitude 4.7, and especially if it pushes toward the zone's historical ceiling near magnitude 5.5, that shifts the risk picture meaningfully. For scale, a magnitude 5.5 releases roughly 700 times the energy of last night's magnitude 3.6. Quakes escalating rather than tapering off is the first warning sign. The second is direction. Watch where the activity moves. If it stays contained beneath Brawley, that's the reassuring scenario. But if it begins migrating north, toward Westmoreland, toward the geothermal field, and above all toward Bombay Beach and the San Andreas terminus, that's the scenario that actually matters, because that's the path that would carry the swarm from 60 kilometers away to directly on top of the fault, back into 2016 territory. Location governs everything with this particular hazard, and northward migration is the single most important thing to track. The third signal is official confirmation. If the USGS issues a formal aftershock forecast, or the state issues an earthquake advisory, the way both happened in 2016 and again during the 2020 Westmoreland swarm, that's your cue that professionals have run the real-time numbers and concluded the odds have shifted enough to say so publicly. You won't have to guess. If that threshold gets crossed, it will be announced the same way it was before. Let's circle back to where we started. Last night, the ground beneath Brawley began shaking again in that same irregular no-main shock rhythm it produced in May and in 2016 before that. By a wide margin, the most probable outcome is that it follows the same pattern it always has. It rises, it rattles, and it fades out over the coming days without producing anything larger than a moderate quake. If you live in the area, the realistic thing to prepare for is a few more restless nights, not a catastrophe. But the reason this story deserves attention isn't the swarm itself. It's the fault next door, the southernmost San Andreas, silent for more than 3 centuries, carrying several meters of stored strain, sitting just 60 kilometers from a patch of ground that won't stop trembling. Science can estimate the odds that any given swarm nudges that fault awake, and those odds are low. What science still can't explain is why the most heavily loaded segment of the most famous fault on the planet has stayed almost perfectly still while everything around it keeps shaking, or which swarm, if any, will finally break that silence. The 3 things to watch remain simple: whether the quakes grow larger, whether they migrate north toward the terminus, and whether the agencies issue a formal advisory. Until one of those things happens, this remains what it most likely is: a noisy night at the doorstep. We'll keep tracking it closely, and if that doorstep starts moving toward the door, you'll be the first to know.